The sun had barely risen when 12-year-old Alex arrived at Atlanta International Airport. His heart thumped with excitement. This was his very first time flying alone. The massive airport buzzed with early morning travelers rushing in all directions, pulling suitcases and staring at their phones. Alex gripped his backpack straps tightly, looking up at the giant screens showing flight numbers. Gate 37, that's where he needed to go. His flight to Chicago would take off in just over an hour. He couldn't wait to tell his grandparents all about how he managed the trip by himself. "You've got this," his dad had told him that morning, giving him a firm hug before dropping him at the airport entrance. "Remember what I always say, act with kindness and dignity, no matter how others treat you." Alex nodded, thinking about his father's words as he walked through the terminal. His dad, Richard Taylor, wasn't just any businessman. He was the CEO of Skyline Airlines, the very company Alex would be flying with today. But his father never flaunted his position, and he'd raised Alex the same way. Even though they lived in a big house and could afford nice things, Alex wore regular clothes like any other kid: faded blue jeans, his favorite red sneakers with a scuff on the left toe, and a plain gray hoodie. No one looking at him would guess his father owned the entire airline. Walking toward Gate 37, Alex rehearsed what he'd say to the flight staff. His dad had arranged a first-class ticket for him, not because they showed off their wealth, but because Richard wanted to keep a closer eye on his son through the cabin crew he personally trained. The boarding area was already filling up with business people in suits, families with crying babies, and elderly couples sitting patiently with their carry-ons. Alex took a deep breath and approached the counter where a flight attendant named Ms. Barker stood checking tickets. She had blonde hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her face, and her mouth was set in a thin line that hadn't smiled all morning. "Good morning," Alex said politely, handing over his ticket. "I'm flying to Chicago today." Ms. Barker glanced down at him, then at the ticket, then back at him. Her eyebrows slowly inched upward. "First class?" she asked, her voice dripping with doubt. "Yes, ma'am," Alex replied. "My father arranged it." Ms. Barker's eyes narrowed as she examined the ticket more closely, turning it over in her hands. Several passengers behind Alex were starting to show signs of impatience, checking their watches and shifting their weight from foot to foot. "This doesn't look right," Ms. Barker finally declared. "Our first-class tickets have a gold border. This looks different." Alex's stomach tightened. "I think there might be a mistake, my dad." "Listen, kid," Ms. Barker cut him off, lowering her voice, but not enough that nearby passengers couldn't hear. "I've worked for Skyline Airlines for 15 years. I know what our tickets look like. This isn't it." Before Alex could explain further, Ms. Barker did something that made his blood run cold. She took his ticket between her fingers and deliberately ripped it in half, then in quarters. "Hey!" Alex protested, reaching out too late as the pieces fluttered onto the counter. "You can't just try to sneak into first class with a fake ticket," Ms. Barker announced loudly, making several heads turn. "Now please step aside for the real passengers." Alex stood frozen in shock, his face burning with embarrassment as everyone stared. An older woman nearby clicked her tongue disapprovingly. A businessman in line frowned at him like he was some kind of criminal. "But my dad—" Alex tried again, his voice cracking. "If you don't move aside right now, I'll call security," Ms. Barker threatened. "You're holding up the line." With shaking hands, Alex pulled out his phone. He needed to call his father. This wasn't right. It wasn't fair. As he stepped away from the counter, he could hear Ms. Barker muttering something about kids these days to the next passenger. Little did she know that in just 20 minutes, she'd be facing the most powerful man in the entire company, a man who wouldn't take kindly to someone tearing up his son's ticket and humiliating him in front of a gate full of strangers. Alex stood to the side of Gate 37, his face burning with shame as passengers continued to stare. His fingers trembled as he tried to call his father, but the airport was noisy, and his hands were shaking so badly he kept mistyping his passcode. "Third time's the charm," he whispered to himself, finally unlocking his phone. He glanced up to see Ms. Barker watching him with narrowed eyes while checking another passenger's boarding pass. She made a show of smiling warmly at an older white couple, directing them to the first-class boarding lane with a sweep of her arm. "Dad's going to fix this," Alex told himself, trying to stay calm. but a knot was forming in his throat, making it hard to swallow. He'd never been treated like this before, like he didn't belong, like he was trying to cheat his way into somewhere he shouldn't be. A small group of business travelers nearby weren't even trying to hide their conversation. "Kids these days think they can get away with anything," said a man in a navy suit, shaking his head. "Where are his parents anyway?" A woman with a pearl necklace added, just loud enough for Alex to hear. Alex wanted to tell them that his father was Richard Taylor, that he owned Skyline Airlines, that he had every right to be in first class. But the words wouldn't come. His dad had always taught him that flaunting who they were was tacky. "Your character speaks louder than your wallet," he often said. Ms. Barker approached, clipboard in hand. "You're still here?" she asked, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Look, I don't know what you're trying to pull, but that ticket was obviously fake. Our system shows no record of an Alex Taylor in first class." "Please," Alex said, finding his voice at last. "Just check again. My dad booked it himself." "Sure he did." Ms. Barker rolled her eyes. "And let me guess, your dad is someone really important, right?" The way she said it made Alex's stomach twist. She was making fun of him. A few people in line chuckled. "Actually," Alex began, but Ms. Barker cut him off. "Listen, this flight is boarding now. Either buy a real ticket or step away from the gate area. You're making the other passengers uncomfortable." An elderly man sitting nearby frowned at Ms. Barker. "The boy's just a kid," he said quietly. "Maybe you could help and call his parents." Ms. Barker's smile was tight as she turned to the man. "Sir, I appreciate your concern, but we have protocols. For all we know, he could be trying to board without proper authorization. It's a security issue." The suggestion that he was some kind of security threat made Alex's eyes sting with tears he refused to let fall. He remembered his father's words from just that morning, "No matter what happens, hold your head high." So he did, even as Ms. Barker returned to her post, even as other passengers continued to whisper and stare. Finally, his phone connected to his father's number. Alex moved to a quiet corner by the window, watching planes taxi on the runway as the line rang. "Hey buddy, everything okay?" His father's voice came through, warm and reassuring. "Dad," Alex said, his voice cracking despite his best efforts. "There's a problem. The lady at the gate, she tore up my ticket. She said it was fake and that I was trying to sneak into first class." There was a pause, then, "She did what?" Alex had rarely heard that tone in his father's voice. It was calm, but there was steel beneath the surface. "She ripped it up right in front of everyone," Alex continued, the words tumbling out now. "She said she'd call security if I didn't move. Everyone's looking at me like I did something wrong." "What's the flight attendant's name?" Richard asked, his voice measured. "Ms. Barker. She's wearing a gold pin with 20 years of service on it." "Stay exactly where you are," Richard said firmly. "Don't go anywhere." "I'm coming to the airport right now." "But your meeting is not as important as this." His father's voice softened. "Are you okay, Alex?" "I'm fine," Alex lied, watching as more passengers boarded, some glancing at him with curiosity or disapproval. "Just hurry, okay?" "I'll be there in 20 minutes. And Alex?" "Yeah, Dad. Remember who you are. Nobody can take that from you." As Alex ended the call, he straightened his shoulders and wiped quickly at his eyes. Ms. Barker was in for a surprise. She thought she was dealing with just some random kid, but she was about to learn exactly whose ticket she had torn up. Richard Taylor sat at the head of a long polished table in the Skyline Airlines executive boardroom. 12 people in sharp business suits stared at charts projected on the wall as the company's financial director droned on about quarterly profits. Richard nodded occasionally, but his mind was on his son's upcoming visit to Chicago. He'd called Alex's grandparents just that morning to make sure everything was ready for their grandson's arrival. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Normally, Richard never answered calls during board meetings. It was one of his strictest rules. But something told him to check. When he saw Alex's name on the screen, a small frown crossed his face. "Excuse me for a moment," he said, standing up smoothly. The financial director paused mid-sentence as Richard stepped into the hallway. "Hey buddy, everything okay?" he answered, expecting to hear about a forgotten toothbrush or a last-minute question. Instead, his son's shaky voice sent a chill down his spine. As Alex explained what had happened, Richard's expression darkened with each word. His free hand clenched into a fist, then slowly relaxed as he reminded himself to stay calm. "She did what?" he asked quietly after hearing about the torn ticket. The details Alex shared made Richard's blood boil, but he kept his voice steady. His son needed him composed, not angry. When Alex mentioned the flight attendant's name and her 15-year service pin, Richard's memory clicked. Barbara Barker. He'd seen her file during a recent review of senior staff. "Stay exactly where you are," Richard instructed his son. "I'm coming to the airport right now." After assuring Alex he'd be there soon, Richard ended the call and took a deep breath. He straightened his red tie, rolled down his shirt sleeves, and buttoned his suit jacket before returning to the boardroom. 12 pairs of eyes turned to him as he entered. "I apologize, but there's an urgent situation at Terminal B that requires my immediate attention," Richard announced. His tone made it clear this wasn't up for discussion. Thomas, the company's vice president, raised an eyebrow. "Anything we should be concerned about?" Richard's face remained professional, but those who knew him well could see the controlled anger in his eyes. "It seems we have an employee who doesn't recognize our company's tickets, or who my son is." A murmur ran through the room as Richard collected his leather portfolio from the table. "We'll continue this meeting tomorrow," he said firmly. "David, please email me those projections. I'll review them tonight." As Richard strode through the company headquarters toward the parking garage, his assistant hurried to keep up with him. "Should I call ahead to the terminal?" she asked, already typing on her tablet. "No," Richard replied. "I want to see exactly how our staff behaves when they don't know they're being watched." In his car, Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly. He'd built Skyline Airlines from a small regional carrier into one of the country's largest airlines, insisting on excellent customer service every step of the way. The thought of any passenger being treated the way his son described made him furious. That it happened to his own child only made it more personal. Traffic crawled between headquarters and the airport. Richard drummed his fingers impatiently on the dashboard. "Come on," he muttered at a red light that seemed to last forever. As he drove, Richard thought about what he'd say to Ms. Barker. He wasn't one for public scenes or throwing his weight around. In 15 years as CEO, he'd never pulled rank or embarrassed an employee in front of customers. He believed in second chances and learning from mistakes. But this was different. This wasn't just a missed connection or a spilled drink. This was about dignity, about respect, about seeing people as people, not making snap judgments based on appearance. The airport parking garage was full, but Richard found a spot reserved for airline executives. He grabbed his ID badge and hurried toward Terminal B, his polished shoes clicking rapidly on the concrete floor. As he reached the main terminal, Richard slowed his pace. He straightened his suit jacket and composed his face. Getting angry wouldn't help Alex. Making a scene wouldn't solve anything. He needed to handle this with the same calm, measured approach that had made him successful in business. But as he rode the escalator up to the departure level and saw Gate 37 in the distance, Richard knew one thing for certain. Ms. Barker was about to learn a very important lesson about judging books by their covers and about tearing up tickets that weren't hers to tear. Richard Taylor walked through the busy terminal with purpose. Unlike many executives who demanded attention when they entered a room, Richard preferred to observe without being noticed. Today, that habit would serve him well. As he approached Gate 37, he spotted Alex sitting alone on a bench, shoulders hunched, staring at his phone. The sight of his usually confident son looking so defeated made Richard's chest tighten. He took a deep breath and reminded himself to stay calm. Alex looked up and his face brightened instantly. "Dad." He jumped up and rushed over. Richard pulled his son into a tight hug. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, looking Alex over as if checking for physical injuries. "I'm fine," Alex said, though his voice cracked slightly, just embarrassed. Richard placed a hand on his son's shoulder, his touch gentle but his eyes serious. "You have nothing to be embarrassed about. You did nothing wrong." He glanced toward the boarding desk where Ms. Barker was checking tickets, her movements brisk and efficient, unaware that her career hung in the balance. "Is that her?" Richard asked quietly. Alex nodded. "That's Ms. Barker." Richard straightened his tie. "Wait here." As Richard approached the desk, he didn't announce himself or push to the front of the line. Instead, he stood patiently, watching how Ms. Barker handled other passengers. Her smile was professional if not warm, but he noticed something troubling. She barely glanced at the tickets of older white passengers before waving them through, while she scrutinized every detail on the tickets of younger passengers or those with darker skin. When his turn came, Richard stepped forward. Ms. Barker's customer service smile appeared automatically. "How can I help you, sir?" she asked, not really looking at him. "I'd like to discuss an incident that happened earlier," Richard said pleasantly. "It involves my son and a first-class ticket." Ms. Barker's smile tightened. "Oh, the young man trying to use a counterfeit ticket. I've already handled that situation, sir. We take security very seriously at Skyline Airlines." "Is that so?" Richard's voice remained calm, but something in his tone made Ms. Barker finally look at him properly. "And how exactly did you handle it?" "Well, Ms. Barker faltered slightly. I explained that we couldn't accept an obviously fake ticket and asked him to step aside." "You didn't just ask him to step aside, though, did you?" Richard's eyes never left hers. "You tore up his ticket. You humiliated him in front of dozens of people. You threatened to call security." Ms. Barker's spine stiffened. "Sir, I don't know what he told you, but I've been with this airline for 15 years. I know our tickets, and that was not a legitimate Skyline Airlines ticket." Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out his company ID, placing it on the counter between them. "I'm Richard Taylor, Chief Executive Officer of Skyline Airlines. That boy is my son, and I personally booked his ticket." The color drained from Ms. Barker's face. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. "Perhaps," Richard continued, his voice still measured but with an edge of steel, "you'd like to explain to me why you thought it was appropriate to tear up a valid ticket and accuse a child of lying." Passengers nearby had gone quiet, sensing the drama unfolding. Ms. Barker's hands trembled slightly as she tried to regain her composure. "Mr. Taylor, there's been a misunderstanding," she said, her voice suddenly much higher. "I was simply following protocol. The ticket didn't look standard, and—" "Our protocol," Richard interrupted, "is to verify questionable tickets through the system, not to destroy them and humiliate passengers. Our protocol is to treat every customer with respect, regardless of their age or appearance." A nearby supervisor, sensing trouble, hurried over. "Is there a problem here?" "Yes," Richard said, turning to face the new arrival. "I'd like you to call Thomas Wilson, our Chief of Operations, and have him meet us here immediately. We need to discuss Ms. Barker's understanding of our customer service protocols." The supervisor's eyes widened as she recognized Richard. "Mr. Taylor." "Of course, right away, sir." Ms. Barker's face had gone from pale to ashen. "Mr. Taylor, please, I didn't realize." "That's precisely the problem," Richard said, his voice now quiet enough that only she could hear. "You made assumptions based on how my son looked, not who he is. And in this company, we don't judge books by their covers." The supervisor returned, practically running. "Mr. Wilson is on his way, sir. He'll be here in 5 minutes." Richard nodded. "Thank you." He turned back to Ms. Barker, whose professional demeanor had completely crumbled. "Now, let's talk about how we're going to make this right." The gate area had become unusually quiet. Passengers pretended to look at their phones or read magazines, but their attention was fixed on the unfolding drama at the boarding desk. Ms. Barker stood frozen behind the counter, her face a mask of horror as Thomas Wilson, the airline's chief of operations, hurried toward them. Thomas was a tall man with salt and pepper hair who'd worked his way up from baggage handler 30 years ago. He recognized Richard immediately. "Mr. Taylor," he said, slightly out of breath. "I came as soon as I heard." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. We have a situation that needs immediate attention." As Richard explained what had happened to Alex, Thomas's expression grew increasingly grim. He turned to Ms. Barker, who was now fidgeting with her gold service pin. "Is this true?" Thomas asked her. "Did you tear up a passenger's ticket?" "I thought it was fake," Ms. Barker stammered. "The border didn't look right, and he's just a—" She stopped herself, but everyone knew what she'd been about to say. "Just a what?" Richard asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Ms. Barker's eyes darted around. "Just a child traveling alone. It seems suspicious." An older woman sitting nearby stood up. "That's not what happened," she said loudly. "I saw the whole thing. You treated that boy like he was trying to pull something over on you. You didn't even try to check his ticket in the system." A businessman in line nodded. "I travel with Skyline every week, and I've never seen a ticket torn up before. There are protocols for suspected fraud that don't involve destroying a passenger's boarding pass." More murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Ms. Barker's face flushed red as she realized she had no defenders. Thomas turned to a junior staff member. "Please get a replacement ticket for Mr. Taylor's son immediately. First class, same seat assignment." The young woman nodded and rushed off. "As for you," Thomas said to Ms. Barker, "I need you to clock out and report to HR. This incident requires a full investigation." "But the flight," Ms. Barker began. "Will be handled by someone else," Thomas finished firmly. "Please go now." As Ms. Barker gathered her things, Richard turned to Alex, who had been watching the whole scene unfold from nearby. "Come here, buddy," Richard said gently. Alex walked over, still looking uncomfortable with all the attention. Richard placed a protective arm around his son's shoulders. "I think everyone here deserves an explanation," Richard said, raising his voice slightly so the waiting passengers could hear. "My name is Richard Taylor. I'm the CEO of Skyline Airlines. This is my son, Alex." A ripple of surprise went through the crowd. What happened here today was unacceptable. Skyline Airlines was built on the principle that every passenger deserves respect and dignity, regardless of their age, appearance, or background. Richard's voice was firm but not angry. "I want to personally apologize for the delay in boarding and for what you've witnessed." The junior staff member returned with a new ticket and handed it to Alex. Thomas took over the boarding process, personally checking each passenger's boarding pass with a warm smile. "Are you sure you still want to go today?" Richard asked Alex quietly. "We could reschedule." Alex straightened his shoulders. "Unsure, Dad. Grandma and Grandpa are waiting." Richard smiled, pride evident in his eyes. "That's my boy." As the line began moving again, Thomas approached father and son. "Alex will be personally escorted to his seat, Mr. Taylor. I've alerted the cabin crew to make sure he has everything he needs." Richard nodded. "Thank you, Thomas. And when you return, I'd like to discuss implementing a company-wide review of our customer service training." "Of course, sir," Thomas agreed. "I think that's an excellent idea." As Alex prepared to board, Richard gave him one last hug. "Call me when you land, okay?" "I will," Alex promised. "And Dad, thanks for coming." Richard watched as his son walked confidently down the jetway. The incident had been ugly, but perhaps some good would come of it. Already, Richard was thinking about how to turn this moment into meaningful change for the entire airline. By the time Alex's plane was halfway to Chicago, the story had already spread like wildfire. A passenger had recorded Richard's calm but powerful confrontation with Miss Barker on their phone, and within hours, the video was everywhere. Airline CEO Cheus UPAFTA Employ EOIPs UP Soans TCKTT read one headline. Flight attendant Elians hard Eliasaton about JDGING Bocus by their COVR declared another. Back in his office, Richard sat at his desk, staring at his computer screen as messages poured in. His assistant knocked lightly on the door. "Sir, the communications team is asking for guidance. The video has over 2 million views already." Richard nodded. He'd expected something like this, though not quite so fast. "Tell them I'll have a statement ready in an hour. And please get Thomas on the phone." As his assistant left, Richard's phone buzzed with a text from Alex, landed safely. "Grandma and Grandpa say hi. Everyone on the plane was super nice to me." Richard smiled, relieved that at least his son was safe and being treated well. He texted back. "Glad to hear it, buddy. Enjoy your visit. Love you." Thomas Wilson arrived at Richard's office 20 minutes later, holding a thick file folder. "You asked about Ms. Barker's employment history," he said, placing the folder on the desk. "It's not good, sir." Richard opened the file. Inside were multiple customer complaints spanning several years, all involving similar behavior, all involving young passengers or people of color being treated with suspicion or disrespect. "Why wasn't this addressed before?" Richard asked, his voice tight. Thomas looked uncomfortable. Different supervisors over the years. Issues logged but never escalated. Small incidents that didn't seem significant on their own. "But show a clear pattern when viewed together," Richard finished, closing the file. "This stops now, Thomas, not just with Ms. Barker, but across the board." Richard spent the rest of the day in meetings with his executive team, the head of human resources, and the company's legal counsel. By evening, the airline had released an official statement. Skyline Airlines is committed to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. The incident at Atlanta International Airport today falls far short of our standards. We have begun a comprehensive review of our training procedures and will be implementing new measures to ensure this never happens again. The employee involved has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. What Richard hadn't expected was the public's reaction. Yes, there were angry comments demanding Ms. Barker be fired immediately. But there were also thousands of supportive messages praising the way he'd handled the situation, calmly, professionally, without making a scene, but also without brushing the incident under the rug. One comment in particular caught Richard's attention. Most CEOs would have sent a representative or issued a fake apology. This man dropped everything to stand up for his son and make it right for everyone involved. That's real leadership. By the next morning, #RespectfulSkis and #Richard Taylor were trending. News programs were using the incident to spark broader discussions about bias in customer service across all industries. Richard's phone rang. It was his mother from Chicago. "The local news just interviewed Alex," she said, sounding both proud and concerned. "He was so poised, Richard, so mature." "They interviewed him?" Richard asked, surprised. "I didn't give permission for that. It was just a quick chat when they spotted us at the grocery store. He handled it beautifully." Later that day, Richard watched the clip online. The reporter had asked Alex how he felt about what happened. "It wasn't just about me," Alex said thoughtfully. "It was about how people get treated when they don't look like what others expect. My dad always says everyone deserves respect, no matter who they are or what they look like." Richard felt a surge of pride watching his son. Alex had understood the bigger picture perfectly. That evening, Richard received an email from a civil rights organization requesting a meeting to discuss how Skyline Airlines might share its upcoming reforms with other companies. Another message came from a diversity training consultant offering services. As Richard read through the emails, he realized this incident wasn't just going to change his airline, it had the potential to change much more. What had begun as a terrible experience for his son was transforming into an opportunity to address a problem much bigger than one torn ticket or one biased employee. 6 months had passed since that day at Gate 37. The morning sun streamed through the windows of Skyline Airlines' main conference room as Richard Taylor adjusted his tie and looked out at the gathered crowd. Reporters, airline staff, and community leaders filled every seat, with cameras set up in the back of the room. "Ready for this?" Richard asked, glancing at Alex, who stood beside him, looking taller and more confident than he had 6 months ago. "Ready," Alex replied, straightening the new blue blazer his grandmother had bought him for the occasion. Thomas Wilson stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us today for the launch of Skyline Airlines' new Respect in Flight initiative. Please welcome our CEO, Richard Taylor." Applause filled the room as Richard took the stage. He smiled at the audience, then began to speak. 6 months ago, an incident occurred that made us take a hard look at ourselves as a company. My son had his ticket torn up by one of our employees who judged him based on his appearance. It was a painful moment, but sometimes pain leads to growth. Richard gestured to a large screen behind him, which displayed the new Skyline Airlines training program. "Today, I'm proud to announce that every single Skyline employee, from baggage handlers to pilots, from gate agents to executives, has completed our new comprehensive training program focused on recognizing and addressing unconscious bias." Photos appeared on the screen showing staff in training sessions, engaged in discussions and activities. "But we didn't create this program alone," Richard continued. "We listened to experts, to community leaders, and most importantly, to our customers who shared their own experiences." Richard paused, his eyes finding Alex in the front row. I'd also like to announce that Skyline Airlines is establishing a scholarship fund for young people interested in aviation careers. We're particularly focusing on students from backgrounds traditionally underrepresented in our industry." This announcement brought a fresh round of applause. Richard smiled and gestured toward his son. "And I'm very proud to introduce our first youth ambassador for the Respect in Flight program, who will help us connect with schools across the country. My son, Alex Taylor." Alex walked confidently to the podium as the audience applauded. Though only 13, he stood tall and spoke clearly into the microphone. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady despite the cameras. "What happened to me that day wasn't fair, but my dad always taught me that it's not just what happens to you that matters, it's how you respond to it." People in the audience nodded in agreement. "Since that day, I've talked to a lot of kids my age who've had similar experiences, not just on planes, but in stores, at schools, and in their neighborhoods. They felt judged before anyone even knew their name." Alex looked up at his father, who nodded encouragingly. "The Respect in Flight program isn't just about airlines," Alex continued. "It's about seeing people for who they really are, not who you think they might be based on how they look." After the presentations, as reporters asked questions and photographers took pictures, a woman approached Richard quietly. "Mr. Taylor? I don't know if you remember me. I was at the gate that day." Richard looked at her. "The passenger who spoke up about what she saw?" She nodded. "I just wanted to say thank you. I fly a lot for work, and I've noticed a real difference with Skyline in the past few months. Your staff seems more present, more respectful to everyone." Later that afternoon, as father and son walked through the terminal toward their flight home, they passed Gate 37. Both paused, remembering. "Do you ever wonder what happened to Ms. Barker?" Alex asked. Richard nodded. "I do. She was let go from Skyline, of course, but I heard she's been taking courses on diversity and inclusion. People can change if they want to." They continued walking, passing a new sign displaying Skyline's commitment to treating all passengers with dignity and respect. "We've come a long way in 6 months," Richard said, placing a hand on his son's shoulder. "But we still have a long way to go," Alex replied with wisdom beyond his years. At their gate, a young flight attendant checked their boarding passes with a warm smile. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Taylor and Mr. Taylor," she said, making eye contact with both father and son. "Thank you for flying Skyline Airlines." As they walked down the jetway together, Richard thought about how a moment of injustice had sparked a movement for change. His company was better for it. The industry was better for it. And most importantly, his son had learned that he had the power to turn a painful experience into something that helped others. Sometimes, Richard reflected, the most important lessons come when we least expect them, even at Gate 37 of an airport on what should have been just an ordinary day.